All right, hi everyone. Welcome back to part two of today's lecture on what is sociology. In the first part, which hopefully you watched by now, and if you haven't, make sure you go back and give that a look. We talked a little bit about what sociology is as a discipline, what we as sociologists are interested in, and what we can do, and sort of what the boundaries of our discipline are. In essence, what don't we do? What do we leave to experts in other fields? So in this part, we're going to focus mostly on the beginnings of sociology. So where did we start as a discipline? What kinds of things were we interested in back then? And then how did sociology develop over time? So in this section, I'm going to give a very, very brief overview of the beginnings of sociology. And if you take a classical theory course, you'll learn much more about these people. But for now, we're just gonna jump through it pretty quickly. So sociology is first traced back to this theorist Khaldun. He actually was alive in the 14th century, and he was an Islamic scholar. He's not often talked about. He's a little bit more talked about nowadays. Sort of our racial politics improve, right, and we start to acknowledge scholars of color. But he's credited as being the first person to study society and be really interested in that. So his work specifically focused on social cohesion, essentially how groups of people stay together, or they're brought together, and also social conflict, what happens when there's conflict in those groups as well. Comte, however, who was a European social theorist, is credited as being part of the big boom of sociology or social theory. So Khaldun was doing work, but it doesn't really take off until this era of the Enlightenment. Now, hopefully, those of you who have taken sort of European history classes, the term the Enlightenment should sound familiar. Okay, so this was this period in European history when suddenly intellectualism boomed. Okay, so prior to the Enlightenment, people put a lot of faith into these big institutions that dominated their everyday life. So the church, their form of government, it sort of controlled them and taught them what to believe. Then we enter this period of the Enlightenment when suddenly science is being done and people are asking these questions about the world and suddenly realizing that they can do research that might even contradict those big institutions that they once relied on. So, for example, if we think about Galileo, he was interested in space, right, and planets, and he, illuminated that, the sun does not revolve around the Earth, but that Earth revolves around the sun, right? And the Catholic Church didn't like that one bit, right, because they taught the opposite of that. But Galileo is this great figure in the Enlightenment because he epitomizes everything it stood for, which is research and science and also social critique, right? That he was taking on this big institution that previously ruled everyone's lives, right? So Comte is also a part of this Enlightenment period, but rather than talking about science, he's thinking about the social world. So he's French, but he coins the term sociology, in French is sociologie, which roughly translates for him into social physics. Right, so he's thinking about this new discipline of physics, right, and he's wondering how can we apply this to the social world and come up with similar principles to think about people and not just, physical natural state of the world. Comte is really important, and the reason we still talk about him in part is because he advocated for what we call positivism. Right? So positivism might sound like happiness or the opposite of negativity, but it actually has a little bit of a different term. People who are positivists are people who rely on data and believe that our conclusions about the world should be data driven. Right? So positivism, just a mouthful at times, really is the worldview that in order to make any sort of conclusion, we need empirical data to rely on. Now that seems a given nowadays, but back then, people were making these grand statements about the world based on conjecture, right, or their own theories. And Comte came in and said, no, in order to do that, we really need to gather data. and go through a rigorous research process to do that. So he's really important for that reason because he advocated for that. He also, we'll go through quickly, had a theory that societies went through 3 stages of development, right? And these were the theological, metaphysical, and positive stages. So his big theory was that societies evolved over time and they went through these concrete stages, and they all sort of followed this pattern. So in the theological stage, which is the preliminary stage the society goes through, they rely on theology, right, on religion, that their world beliefs are driven by religious ideals, et cetera, et cetera. He argued that eventually we would grow out of that, we would no longer rely on religion as heavily as we did in the beginning, and we would enter what he calls the metaphysical stage, right? So no longer are we relying on religion here, but our ideas about the world are driven by abstract philosophical speculations, right? So still no data here, but no religion. And I'll give examples of this in a second that I think will clarify some questions. And then finally, the epitome of society, he argued, was positivism, that we would rely on observation, experiments, comparisons to make conclusions about the social world. So let's come up with some examples of this to make this make more sense. So let's take the example of the weather, and what explanations a society might give to explain the weather based on their period of development. So if we're in this theological stage, we might use explanations like God is angry at us and therefore there's a thunderstorm, or God is punishing us, or angels are crying when it rains. These sorts of religious-based explanations. When we move into the metaphysical stage, we're relying on abstract notions, but not gathering data to make conclusions. So this would be something like April showers bring May flowers. Okay. In that statement, we're making some conclusion about the world, right? That it rains a lot in April, and that's important because it brings flowers. But there's no data there, right? It's kind of like this old wives' tale abstract concept of the world. We're still not fully developed. In positivism, this is when we get to having weathermen as a career path, right? Using science and data to predict weather changes and explain them, et cetera, et cetera. The other really important contribution Comte had was that he believed society is more than just the accumulation of individuals, right? So it's not enough to think of society as just like one person plus another person equals a group, right? But that society has kind of its own characteristics that are different than just studying individuals, okay? So it's not enough to just look at society as a clump of people, but to look at society as almost a force unto itself. Something that is worth studying in its own field. After Comte, we have lots of different kinds of theorists. We have Locke and Adam Smith, right? We also have social Darwinism, right, which very briefly was just sort of this problematic worldview that we could apply evolution to think about who was socially the most fit or unfit. Spoiler alert, it was mostly just racist, veiled racism, not veiled that heavily. But after Comte, we're still missing this truly positivist sociological approach that Comte was advocating for, right? That we should study society as a social physics with positivism, and this view of society is not just a group of individuals. So we're still sort of missing that. All right, so then enter this contemporary sociologist, C. Wright Mills. C. Wright Mills was born in 1916 and died in 1962, so not that long ago. He was an American sociologist, and he's credited as writing the book The Sociological Imagination, which is one of sort of the most foundational texts we have as sociologists. And this is him over here. I like to include this picture just because everyone loves floating this picture around. It's him on his motorcycle. Apparently he was an unconventional academic and sometimes a little bit of a pain in the ass. Okay, so I have these series of quotes. I'm just going to read them. I encourage you to pause the video and reread them for yourself and try and pull out things that seem meaningful to you here. So this quote from the book The Sociological Imagination says, "Nowadays, men often feel that their private lives are a series of traps. They sense that within their everyday worlds, they cannot overcome their troubles, and in this feeling, they are often quite correct. What ordinary men are directly aware of and what they try to do are bounded by the private orbits in which they live. Their visions and their powers are limited to the close-up scenes of job, family, neighborhood." All right, so to start off with, we have this paragraph describing a sense of feeling trapped, right? Trapped in our everyday lives and sort of our own little bubbles, right? That somehow what they try to do or what they're aware of is limited in some way by maybe their immediate surroundings, right? To this close-up scenes of job, family, and neighborhood. So Mills is hinting at here, right, that we're limited by looking at our own lives. Our singular individual lives are limiting us in some way and a sense of feeling trapped. So he goes on to say, underlying the sense of being trapped are seemingly impersonal changes in the very structure of continent-wide societies. The facts of contemporary history are also facts about the success and the failure of individual men and women. When a society is industrialized, a peasant becomes a worker, a feudal lord is liquidated or becomes a businessman. When classes rise or fall, a man is employed or unemployed. Okay, so essentially, what Mills is doing here is connecting that sense of feeling trapped in your own life to what's happening around you. So, what's happening in the very structure of continent-wide societies. So, Mills here is drawing for us a connection between our individual lives and what's happening in the society around us. Okay, so what just happened there? There we go. So he gives a couple of examples here, right? When a society is industrialized, a peasant becomes a worker. In essence, he's saying when these big economic industrial changes happen in a society, the individuals also change, right? They become a worker rather than a peasant or a farmer. When classes rise or fall, so when we see these big economic changes, a man is employed or unemployed. So in essence, these individual changes in our lives are also dependent on what's happening in the big picture around us society-wide. Okay, so Mills again is drawing, as I was just saying, this distinction between our personal troubles versus what he calls public issues. So in essence, what's happening in our own little orbits, right, in our own little lives versus what's a public issue, what's happening in the news, what's happening society-wide or nationwide. And he's arguing that these private orbits we're in are not actually private. So for example, when there's a big economic change, you might be unemployed. And that unemployment feels very personal, but it's actually not personal. It's because something bigger is happening society-wide. So in essence, what Mills is saying is that there's this interesting connection between the individual, all of us individually, and what's happening historically. Okay. So I think this summarizes it really great. He says the individual can understand his own experience only by locating himself within his period, that he can know his own life chances in life by becoming aware of those of all individuals and his circumstances. So in essence, in order to understand what's happening in our own lives, we have to look beyond ourselves and we have to look at what's happening in this historical period that we're a part of in our cultural context. That if we only look at ourselves, we're only getting part of the picture, right? We kind of need to expand our own view. So, well, wait, I'll give you a couple examples in a second. The reason that Mills is writing about this is he's urging sociologists to adopt what he calls the sociological imagination, okay, which is essentially to say he wants people to see the broad patterns in society that impact individual people. He says we'll learn very little by looking at the individual, but if we look at the historical context, the societal changes that are happening around those individual people, we're going to see some really interesting things and things that are more meaningful than understanding personal anecdotes or just the individual. So here I have that unemployment example that he's talking about in that paragraph, right? So the private trouble version of unemployment, or essentially the individual perspective of unemployment, right, is that someone might be laid off from their job and then they have a hard time paying for their mortgage. Okay, that's meaningful. We feel very bad for that person. We learn very little from the individual perspective, though, because lots of things could be going on in their life. However, if we look at unemployment as a public issue, essentially something that is happening society-wide that's influenced by history, we might see that there is an economic recession and that unemployment has skyrocketed. Okay, so not just that individual person's unemployed, but suddenly unemployment's at an all-time high, right? We could think about this in the current context of COVID-19, right? Lots of people are unemployed. You might know lots of people who are unemployed yourself, right, in your own life. Um, and if we just looked at those individual people, we wouldn't get a real picture of why unemployment is really high right now. Okay, so this isn't just an academic issue. There are real life implications for how we think about this, right? So consider the topic of obesity in these headlines that I have listed here. Okay. So one way to think about obesity is to think about it as a social issue. Okay, so we have this headline here that says obesity is a social issue and not just a health issue. Okay, we could also think about obesity as an individual level issue. So this research paper is talking about individual overeating and addiction. Okay, the way that we frame this issue, right? So is obesity a social issue that's driven by low socioeconomic status, about culture, et cetera, versus framing obesity as an addiction and an individual issue? That also changes how we address the problem, right? Do we go and address the root social issue, or do we try and get individual interventions to stop this addictive behavior? Okay, so how we frame a problem as individual or inherently social, whether we use that sociological imagination to understand it, has real life consequences for how we think about issues and then how we deal with them. All right, so in essence, right, by looking at Mills, we get a sense of what we're doing as sociologists, what the sort of the goal is in using sociology, and how we think as a sociologist. I want to move now to thinking about different ways we can use sociology to think about the social world. In essence, like what kind of frameworks we can use to make arguments about the social world. So one you guys will get used to me misspeaking in lecture. My tongue gets tied a lot. Um, so one way we can think about the social world is through the dynamics of agency, culture, and what we call structure. So let's talk a little bit about what that is. When we're talking about agency, culture, and structure, in essence, we're asking what social force, okay, so in essence, what part of society acts upon us? What social force are we interested in looking at? Right, so the first is agency. I will say we rarely discuss agency in sociology, but it does come up sometimes. Agency is just a fancy way of saying free will. Okay, so one perspective we can take on the social world is that it's a world full of individuals with a sense of agency, right, who can do what they want and they have choices in how they act, right? We rarely discuss this in sociology because we're more interested in how our lives are determined by social forces, right? But it is relevant sometimes. So an example of a statement where agency would be highlighted is this example here. I got into college because I worked really hard, right? So I got into college not because anyone helped me or because I'm privileged in some way, but because I just worked really hard. I wanted it, I did it. Okay? We can contrast that to taking a cultural view of society. Now, when we're talking about culture, we're talking about a system of societal values and norms. Okay, so in essence, a value is just what it sounds like, right? It's a value, things that are important to us in society, things that we hold near and dear collectively. Okay, and obviously there's going to be some variance in there. But as a general rule of thumb, what does our society value? So for America, that might be freedom. It might be individuality, monogamy, economic success, et cetera, et cetera. These are sort of stereotypical, general, collective things that as Americans we hold near and dear. Culture is also based on norms, right? So, what are the expected behaviors in a society? So, for us, that might be the norm of going to college and getting a degree. That's pretty normative nowadays. We could talk about gender norms, right? How are you expected to act as a man, or as a woman? We could think about etiquette norms. What happens when you sneeze? What are you supposed to do? Holding the door open for people. We see right now that our norms are changing, right, for those types of things as we're in this pandemic. So when we're talking about culture, we're talking about this set of values and norms that are collective to a society. Okay. So if we're thinking about the issue of college through a cultural lens, we might say, I went to college because my parents always valued higher education, right? So not just because I wanted to go to college and I worked really hard, but because the value of higher education was instilled in me, and therefore I felt a little compelled to go to college. And then finally, we can think about structure, right? And structure is very broadly a system of opportunities and constraints in society. So in essence, depending on our social location, our social identities, we might be granted opportunities in life, or we might have a harder time doing things in life because of our social identity. So, for example, we could think about how gender is structured, right? That as a woman, it might be a little bit harder for you to do certain things than it is for a man, where it might be a little bit easier. We could also think about race, right? Whereas a white person, you might be allotted certain privileges in life versus a person of color, right? Where it would be harder, and you're gonna face barriers maybe to getting a job, or et cetera, et cetera. So if we're thinking about structure in college, someone might say, I was able to go to college because my parents have enough money for Rutgers tuition. In essence, because of my social location, my class identity, I had this opportunity to go to college because my parents had enough money. Okay, and of course, we can think about the flip side of that as well. So we're going to routinely come back to these ideas in our class. And when we think about different topics like gender or race, we're going to think about what's the cultural explanation, what's the structural explanation for this. So this is important information we're gonna repeatedly come back to. And then finally, we have a different set of lenses we can use, which is essentially what level is your analysis at? If we think about looking at society through a microscope, in essence, how zoomed in are we going to get, or how zoomed out are we going to get? How small of a picture, how big of a picture are we going to take in society? If we start at the most zoomed out, we're at what we call the macro level, right? And at the macro level, we're looking at society at large. We're thinking about organizations, institutions, networks of people. We're thinking about populations as a whole. We're dealing with like a lot of data, and we're very far zoomed out, right? So we might, at a macro level, study negotiations between nations. We might look at big societal trends like rising or falling divorce rates, for example, things that are happening at a population level, or thinking about broad collective cultural attitudes that a society holds. If we move down a notch, we're then at the meso level, okay? And at the meso level, we're not the most zoomed in we can be, but we're moving away from that highly zoomed out perspective. So at the meso, we're looking at small groups, okay? So not huge organizations or institutions, but small groups of people, because we're still sociologists, right? Or interactions between people. How are interactions between, for example, me, the instructor, and you guys as students, how are those socially prescripted? And then finally, we arrive at the most zoomed in, which is the micro level, okay? The micro level even blurs the line sometimes with social psychology. We're going to spend a lot of time talking about the micro level and talk about how sociologists deal with this. At the micro level, we're thinking about social identity, okay, so things that are more personal to us as individuals, and socialization, which we're going to talk a lot more about but is in essence the process we go through to be indoctrinated into a society. Okay. So we might ask questions at the micro level like, how was your sense of self shaped by your culture? Or how were you socialized according to your race or gender? Or how is your self-esteem dependent on your social environment? So here again, we're thinking very small, almost thinking about the individual, right? But the individual in context of a broader society. And again, we're going to come back to this a lot. This will, by the end of the course, you guys will have this nailed down a whole lot. All right, so just to get a hand at practicing some of these concepts, I have some examples here and we're going to go through them. And I encourage you, after I read them, to just pause it, kind of make your own guess about what lens you think is being used here, and then we'll talk about it a little bit more. So the first one, Martha walks into the classroom. Only one other person has sat down. She makes sure to choose a desk that's not directly next to the other student. Okay, so is this an example of structure, culture, or free will? I would say that this is probably a good example of culture. Some of you may have guessed free will, and certainly that's part of it here as well, right? She's making a choice of what desk she wants to sit at. The reason I think culture is at work here as well is that last sentence. She makes sure to choose a desk that's not directly next to another student. In essence, she's following some sort of cultural etiquette, some sort of social norm about where she would sit. She knows it's weird to walk into a class and sit directly next to another person when there's maybe like a plethora of seats around them. Okay. So let's move on to the second one. A sociologist wants to learn more about how national economic trends impact political attitudes. So is this macro, meso, or micro? So hopefully all of you are guessing macro, right? We're talking about general economic trends. We're very much in the macro level. We're really zoomed out. Okay. Third one, John is unable to afford a preventative medication his doctor prescribed to him. In a couple of months, John needs to schedule a more expensive doctor visit because he could not buy the medication. Right? So is this structure, culture, or free will? And this is certainly structure. All right, so we know that John needs a medication, but he can't buy it because of some sort of constraint, right? He can't afford it. So John is experiencing some sort of structural constraint. This is 100% structure. And then lastly, knowing that she's going to run into her crush, Tom, Jill makes sure to wear a nice outfit and put on some makeup. So this is macro, meso, or micro. And this is certainly meso. Okay, so we're not at the macro level because we're not talking about big societal trends here. We're not talking about the population. We're talking about two individual people. And we're at the meso certainly because we're thinking about interaction, okay, some sort of cultural interaction. So Jill knows that she's meeting her crush. She wants to look nice for him, okay. She understands the gendered nature of this interaction, probably, that she should look probably a certain way when meeting him. And so because we're talking about interaction, we're very much in the meso. Okay, and if you got any of these wrong, remember, we're going to keep coming back to this. So this will be natural by the end of the course. All right, so that leads us to the end of our lecture today. So this is your discussion prompt. You'll also find this linked in the module if you just want to go there, and the prompt is written out as well. All right, so for this prompt, I want us to think a little bit more about C. Wright Mills. So in this discussion post, I want you to pick one social phenomenon. So we talked about unemployment, for example, in the lecture. I want you to identify what the individual level explanation for that event would be, and then what the sociological explanation for the event would be. So I have an example put down here of something you might write. So choose something other than divorce. Think about your own example. So the individual level is couples might get divorced because someone cheats or they fight all the time about money, right? That there's just some sort of issue within that individual couple that they can't resolve. If we think sociologically, we might say, alternatively, people are most likely to divorce because of financial issues. Because of this, more couples got divorced during the financial crash of the early 2000s. All right, so in the first part, we had this individual level explanation for why a couple might break up. In this second part, we're looking at, well, how might what's happening in the surrounding society in that historical period influence these couples and drive a divorce rate? Okay, so for this prompt, I want you guys to come up with your own example, some sort of social phenomenon, and then what the individual level explanation might be, and then how a sociologist we could explain that. Okay, and I will, of course, be going through the discussion. I'll be commenting along with you guys to make sure that everyone's on the right track. All right, other than that, I hope to see you all in office hours so we can meet face to face and I can ask any of your questions. But if not, please let me know if you have any questions, and I will see you guys in the next lecture.